Protests in the modern world play an integral role in civic life. They have shaped public policy, provided momentum for social movements, and even toppled autocratic regimes. The proliferation of new technologies, such as cell phones and social media, has hugely influenced the way protests are organized and executed. To fully assess technology's impact on protests, we will take a look at four diverse movements from the past couple years: the Tahrir Square protests, which unfolded in Egypt in 2011, the Gezi Park protests, which took place in Turkey in 2013, the Hungarian internet tax protests of 2014, and the People's Climate March, also of 2014, which took place internationally but centered around New York City. The Tahrir Square protests of 2011, also known as the Egyptian Revolution, started as a demonstration against police brutality but soon escalated into a generalized revolt against Egypt's president, Hosni Mubarak. In the months leading up to the protests, Egyptians used personal blogs to criticize the government, as freedom of speech and of the media had been severely curtailed. The internet thus provided Egyptians with their primary platform for discussing dissenting opinions and convincing others to take action. The first physical protest, which took place on January 25, 2011, was sparked by a viral video blog created by activist Asma Mahfouz. In the video blog, she implored her fellow Egyptians to not be afraid and to join her in Tahrir Square to protest police brutality and government corruption. Protesters also used Facebook, Twitter, and text messaging to organize demonstrations. According to a study of the protests by sociologist Zeynep Tufekci, social media use greatly increased the odds that a respondent attended the protests on the first day. As one activist tweeted during the uprisings in Tahrir Square, "We use Facebook to schedule the protests, Twitter to coordinate, and YouTube to tell the world." Ultimately, the Tahrir Square protests were successful in ousting Mubarak, largely thanks to the power of social media. Since then, a new government led by Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has been elected, but still, human rights abuses at the hands of the government continue. Social media was able to unite disparate groups behind the relatively simple, common cause of dethroning Mubarak, but establishing a more equitable ruling system has proven too complex. Social media essentially crowdsourced the organization of the protests, allowing people to join for diverse or even somewhat conflicting reasons. Thus, it prevented the formation of a core leadership group with long-term plans. So when Mubarak finally resigned from the presidency, the protesters didn't have a comprehensive and unified framework to execute the reforms which they had been demanding all along. A similar phenomenon occurred during the Gezi Park protests in Turkey. Much like protesters in Egypt, discontent people in Turkey used social media to share opinions and cover news stories which the state-run media had censored. The hashtag #OccupyGezi became a prominent rallying cry on Twitter, and protesters even created an Occupy Gezi Tumblr page sharing images of the uprisings taken by citizen journalists. In a famous incident after the protests had begun, the Turkish version of CNN aired a documentary about penguins, while CNN International covered breaking news about the increasingly violent state of protests at the same time. Turkish media thus became known as the penguin media, and images of penguins wearing gas masks proliferated throughout the rest of the protests as a symbol of government injustice. Almost half of Turkey's 8 million people participated in the Gezi Park protests, representing an incredibly wide range of political views and social backgrounds. Phone cameras coupled with social media allowed citizen journalists to rally people to the protests, with photos such as this one going viral as proof of police brutality and government injustice. Social media once again increased the amount of people in the streets, but it decreased the movement's overall credibility. Since it was comparatively easy to organize the protests via a few clicks on social networking platforms, government officials didn't take protesters' ability to create lasting change all that seriously. Furthermore, no leadership group or unified demands emerged due to the sheer amount of beliefs and demographics which were represented, and the protests blew over without significant change in the government ever taking place. Unlike the Egyptian Revolution and the Gezi Park protests, The People's Climate March took place mainly in democratic countries, while smaller marches were staged in 162 countries, including Germany, Brazil, and Qatar. The main march took place in New York City. The march was called by writer and activist Bill McKibben, although most of the people involved never even heard of him. This echoed the impersonal nature of both the Tahrir Square movement and the Gezi Park protest, where no core leadership group spearheaded the organizing effort. Once again, social media played a huge role in organizing the protest, with the People's Climate March website providing participants with their primary source of information about the march. Social media also played an important role in spreading awareness about the march, with the hashtag #PeoplesClimate trending on both Twitter and Facebook. The march was timed to coincide with the beginning of a UN summit on climate change and was intended to prove to policymakers that climate change was too important to be ignored any longer. Although over 400,000 people attended the march in New York City alone, no monumental change was forged at the UN summit. In the fear of deterring potential participants, the organizers of the march had shied away from creating a set of demands for the UN regarding climate change, and the interests which the protesters represented were too diverse to form a cohesive whole. Lacking a comprehensive set of demands, the UN could essentially ignore the protesters, since none of them had set an ultimatum which they could ultimately enforce. Thus, social media hindered protesters' ability to gain serious concessions regarding climate change, since it enabled organizers to put together a huge group of participants without ever thinking about their long-term goals. On October 21, 2014, the increasingly dictatorial government of Hungary introduced plans to tax its constituents' internet usage. In response, and on that same day, 27-year-old Hungarian political blogger Balázs Gulyás launched a Facebook page titled "100,000 az internetadó ellen," which literally translates to 100,000 against the internet tax. This page provided information about anti-internet tax demonstrations, which began 5 days later. Gulyás was the primary organizer of the two main protests which took place in Hungary's capital city of Budapest, and also gave speeches at both of these protests. Hungarian citizens took to the Twitter sphere as well, using the hashtag netadó, or internet tax. Over 100,000 people attended the main protests in Budapest out of frustration with the proposed tax, but also out of general dissatisfaction with the incredibly corrupt nature of Hungarian politics. Following the protests, the government decided to drop the idea of the tax. The protesters had rallied for the singular goal of eliminating the proposed internet tax, a simple goal compared to those of the Tahrir Square movement or of the Gezi Park protesters. Since there were virtually no details to be contested in this aim, the protesters were able to unilaterally call for a solution rather than demanding countless concessions on behalf of different factions. The government was thus given only two options to choose from. They could either implement the internet tax and grievously offend a very vocal and potentially violent majority, or they could scrap the proposed tax and placate the protesters. The internet tax protests were able to succeed because of the simplicity of their aim and the homogeneity of their beliefs.